This is a really tough story. I mean, if you really read this and sit with this and think about what's really going on here, it is a tough, tough story. Did you ever thank the Old Testament writers for being honest? You can have that chance now. Just say, thank you for being honest. If they would have tried to cover up the reality of the different things that they have done through various stories, this is just one of them. I'm not sure how we would see ourselves, if we could be honest with ourselves, if these texts were not honest about who God's people have been. And I'm going to try to place this story in the context of what I've been talking about over the last several Sundays about reorienting ourselves to basically the nature of the church. What is this thing that we are called to? Why do we gather here? For those of you who may be visiting and haven't been to hear these, I'm going to do a little review here in the beginning because I want to have you walk around this symbol again that's up on the PowerPoint. It's being projected. And what I want to point out is that this symbol is not static. It doesn't just sit there in the way you see it. It's always moving. This image kind of came together through some of my own study and work when I was at the Center for Justice and Peace Building at Eastern Mennonite University, which, as many of you would know, John Paul Lederach had a great influence there. And some of these concepts come from him. But as I've worked with churches, I began to see a little different way in which these three different things around the outside of this circle interplay with each other, how they get tangled up with each other, and how they're always on the move. Now, I want to start out with one of the things that John Paul Lederach talked about in one of his writings that I really like, is just a theory of change. Now, all of us know we have been going through tremendous change for how many years now? Like the iPhone, the smartphone that came to be has just changed so many different things. It's brought our culture's brought lots of things into the church in ways that it has changed. And our church is part of that culture, and we have changed, and we're trying to figure out what to do with it. So what do you do with this theory of change? How do you make it simple? And I thought he did a really good job, and he said it this way. Change is simply this. This is how it works. You start here at a point, and you move forward. And then you hit a wall. And then you move backwards, and then everything falls apart. It's a pretty basic and simple idea of change. And we run into those moments where it really feels that way, that we get hit with something that we thought we were moving forward, we hit a wall, now we're moving backward, and then something happened, and here it is all laying on the floor, all fell apart. I didn't see this coming. And he insightfully says that we can think that we just come back to where we were, where we started, that we're just spinning our wheels. And it can be disillusioning. Is this all it is? Is that we just keep doing this over and over and over again throughout our lives? Is that all it is? And he points out that no, it's not like that, because you're not at the same place. It's much more like it's going forward and backwards and down, but then it keeps going more forward, and we'll go backwards and down, and we're spinning forward. Yeah, it feels like we're going backwards sometimes, but we are moving forward. Our stories continue to progress. We change each time we go around that circle. The way that God works with us, molds us, and shapes us each time that we go around. Now, can you insert that image that's being projected into that idea? That we are created in the image of God. We looked at that in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. That God chose to represent God's image, male and female, all of us, humankind, that's where we reflect the image of God to the world. So that's the starting point, the center. And then in that male and femaleness, in that idea of diversity, that we all come together, we're intended to be living in community. And part of that idea of community is that no one person can fully reflect God's image on their own. We all have a part of it, but it's in the way that we interact with each other, in our relationships, that brings about this kind of community that seems to be intended in the first couple chapters of Genesis. And God also gave us a freedom to create, God gave us gifts of creativity so that in a real way, we're also able to make something come into existence that never existed before. This building being one of them. Some architect had to use their creativity to begin piecing this together. We can do that. But one of the things that is hard to understand is that if we go from community, use our creativity to make things better, then we come around to a point of, you could say that this would be change on this downward side on your left. But change often is what leads us into conflict. So the question is it inevitable in the way that God had set the world, where we ended, in a way, kind of created to be in conflict with each other? Is there a way to avoid that? I'm not sure that there is. Now, maybe back in the garden, with the original intent, and Adam and Eve, and if they would have had their family, and if there would have never been that eating of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, maybe it could have been a world without conflict. I mean, there was a time there where even the animals didn't harm each other. Maybe that's what Revelation is talking about. You know, when it gets these in Isaiah, talking about the lamb and the lion being together. Maybe it's possible. But in this world, I think we tend to go around this circle. But the whole challenge is, if we find ourselves in conflict, can we bring ourselves back to a sense of community? And what I have seen over and over is, when we get up the top of this hill, this creativity sometimes takes over as a way to influence others, to make choices that just keeps climbing and climbing and climbing until there's some kind of a trigger that happens, and then it comes crashing down like a roller coaster around the conflict side. And then there's that whole question of, this has so much energy now, is there any way to get it back to a sense of community? Now I want to look with that idea at this story of Jacob and Esau. Try to imagine them being in our age, our world right now. Can you imagine the excitement that we would have if we have, and I don't know that there is, Jasmine, I don't think you're having twins, but if there was somebody who had twins, Rebecca knew that there was this battle going on within her womb in just a couple chapters before. And she came to God and she said, what in the world is going on? You know, you talk about a complicated pregnancy. There's just a real fight going on. She's getting sore ribs and sore muscles, and none of her other peer group seems to be dealing with this. You know, so what in the world is happening to me? And God tells her, there's 2 nations in your womb, and they're both going to be blessed, but the older one is going to serve the younger one. And I don't know what all that would have meant to Rebecca, but it seems as though she became determined to make sure that that happened. And the way that this story plays out, you see tremendous creativity starting to enter this narrative. Once that Jacob and Esau were born, and think about that's how we say the name. It's really, if it were us, wouldn't we be saying Esau and Jacob because Esau was born first? I mean, he comes out with this kind of ruddy red hair, and Jacob is not far behind, and he grabs onto Esau's heel as Esau is being born. But we still would have named them probably with Esau first, but we always refer to him as Jacob and Esau, even though Jacob is the younger. So I'm thinking that in their world, there would have been that first picture that they would have taken, the ones they would have posted to Instagram or Facebook, and it would have been Isaac and Rebekah and Esau and Jacob. And there we go with a snap and send it on. And our boys arrived healthy and strong. And everybody would have been glad for it. And then as they grew, there was a favoritism that started to happen, where in chapter 25 it says that Isaac, who had a taste for wild game, loved Esau, who was the hunter. But Rebekah, who would have been around Jacob a lot more, and perhaps he was a bit of a mama's boy. I can say that because I was. Perhaps he was a bit of a mama's boy, that she loved him. Now look at your bulletin cover. There is a portrait there of somebody's family. Imagine this is them, the first snap that was taken. But you notice it's a fractured picture now. But if you have a family where one parent loves one child and one loves the other, that's probably going to be the first little chink in that glass, the first little chip like you get on your windshield, that if you don't pay attention to that little chip is going to start to grow and it's going to start to fracture the entire thing. And it does kind of do that. This continues on, and when we find out that Isaac is going to give this blessing to Esau, as Jim read through this scripture, isn't the creativity just amazing? I've never heard of any kids dressing up as Esau for Halloween, but it'd be interesting to see how well they could do. Jacob must have done a pretty good job. Dresses up like his brother, and to really think you could pull this off. I mean, Isaac couldn't see, but he wasn't deaf. And he was confused by Jacob's voice. You feel like Esau, but you sound like my son Jacob. And I don't think I really noticed before basically just the outright lie that he says as he goes through this. Oh, yes, I am. I am your son. Well, how did you get back here so fast with this game and this tasty meat? And he even brings God into it and says, God gave me success. Gave me a very quick hunting trip. And they know this is going to cause a lot of pain. Rebekah even says to Jacob, do this, and whatever the fallout is, whatever happens, let that curse be upon me. I'm ready to take it. And she had to know how this was going to devastate the family. Maybe not to the extent that it actually did. I sometimes wonder when they're making these choices, as with all of us, there's unintended consequences to everything that we do. And sometimes, even though we think we know the outcome, we can't quite really predict how somebody else is going to respond to our own action. So in all of this creative deception, Isaac goes ahead and he gives his blessing to Jacob. Now, I have a hard time understanding, why can't this just be like somebody who is speaking on television and they misspoke and then they walk it back? We hear that all the time. Hey, the person walked back their comments. Like, well, that's not quite what I intended. This is what I really meant. Understand the whole context, whatever. But you understand what I mean. Why can't this just be walked back? But as one commentator suggested, in this oral tradition and in this culture, to say these words of blessing would be like letting an arrow fly and trying to get it back. You just can't. In their culture, you could not walk that back. And here's where the grief starts to tumble in by the bucketfuls. Isaac trembles violently when he finds out that he had been deceived, that he actually had blessed Jacob instead of Esau. And he says, then Esau says, your brother came deceitfully and took your blessing. And Esau said, "Isn't he rightly named Jacob?" Which is, again, that heel grabber, that deceiver. That seemed to be a part of who Jacob always was, that deception. But it wasn't just him alone. It was coming down through the generations. For us to be able to put this story in what was projected up there, to understand how when we get into this kind of conflict, this kind of brokenness that shatters the family portrait, the frame, there is a before and there's an after with those kinds of points. There is so much brokenness there, you can't just wipe it all away. Can we just go back to how it was before? You can't do that. And I would imagine that as all of us look at that broken frame on the front of the bulletin, we probably can fill in the details of our own stories, where we can think of relationships where there was a before, and then there was something really significant that happened, and then there was an after. And we often sit with that and wonder, how do we do that as a family? How do we do that as friends? How do we do that as a church? How do we do that as a nation, as a global community, find our way back to a sense of community? And I'd like to broaden in that a little bit of the definition of sin. I grew up in a community where sin was basically had to do with what you did and didn't do. And for the most part, the things you were definitely supposed to avoid. But I was reading some of Walter Brueggemann about this passage, and he made an interesting comment that I think is really interesting to the idea of the definition of sin. And he says, sin is more than an individual act. Sin is a force. The seeds get sown that actually get acted upon. They get sown much earlier. And you can see that image with Cain and Abel. When God came to Cain and said, he was incredibly jealous of Abel and told him, "Cain, sin is crouching at your door and you must master it." That gives you an idea of that force that is going on here. And once it gets moving, it's just so hard to stop, so difficult to take it another direction. And yet, wrapped up in all of that is our desire to know. I think some of this goes back to the eating that fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because we just want to know. Because if we know, we can control where this is going. We can control the outcome. We're all kind of control freaks. I mean, you know what I mean? It's like when you're watching somebody do something, it's like, I'm not a control freak, but can I show you the right way to do that? We all have a little bit of that in us when we know, or we think we know. I've tried to do that for my family in all the different moves that we've made. There's been different points along the way. I wanted to find a way to grab something, to pull some lever so I could control the outcome, so that we wouldn't be dealing with another transition. And in some ways, some of the things that I worked out as a counselor pointed out to me and just said, "Robert, you're trying to make this okay for everybody, but every time that you do that, somebody gets hurt. Can you just be able to allow other people to also, in our family, sit with this? And can we work at this together?" I wonder sometimes how this story would have worked out. Like, did Rebecca ever share that vision with Isaac? That God told me that the younger is going to be the one to rule over the older. I wonder if she ever shared that. Because sometimes we don't have the whole story, and we judge each other by the perception of what we think we know, and we can even make decisions that we think are going to be for the best. And I just think one of the craziest lines in this whole story is after Rebecca orchestrates this whole thing, Esau ends up getting incredibly angry. He hates Jacob and wants to kill him. And Rebecca pulls Jacob aside and says, "Jacob, go to my family in Haran and tell Esau forgets what happened." You all know that families are not fooled by time or distance. When things like this happen, and you know you're coming together for Thanksgiving dinner, you might already be thinking about, how am I going to avoid that conversation? It's just a reality of how do we find our way back to that sense of community. Another interesting quote that I came across points this out again about our wanting to know and wanting to be able to control things, that says our anxiety does not come from thinking about the future. It comes from wanting to control it. All right, so does that mean that we should do nothing? Do we just look at this story and say, boy, this is pretty hopeless? Then we'd be better off maybe not gathering on a Sunday morning. Let's just live and let everyone make up their own mind. I don't think that's an option for us. Where's the hope in it then? I ask myself that. Well, I see hope in a couple different ways. The first one is that, in spite of the way the Old Testament stories cycle around that circle, using their creativity to be able to harm other people, breaking a sense of community, Cain killing Abel, that God still spared Cain, offered him grace, even made it so nobody else would take his life. When Adam and Eve sinned, they didn't die immediately. Yes, there were consequences to it, but God blessed them with children, blessed them with a family. And even in the case of Jacob and Esau, they spent years and years apart in separate communities. But eventually they came back together again, because God told Jacob to go home, that he had something he wanted to work out with him and Esau. And I want to talk about that some more in a couple weeks. But God continues to work with us. In spite of us using our gifts to break, to harm, to disempower, God still works with us and walks with us. And we are the image of God. Walter Brueggemann was also pointing out that in this passage, and referring back to Genesis, not this passage, but referring to the Genesis 1 and 2, the creation account, it most likely was an oral tradition that would have gone against the common thinking of that time period, where the king was the one who represented the image of God. But in this sense, in the creation of male and female, humankind representing the image of God, that is you. You don't look to the king. Don't look to the president. Don't look to any world leader to be that mirroring image of God. It's you. This is where it starts, right here. And there's a verse from Ephesians that I want to read that captures this so well. Ephesians chapter 1. In him we are also chosen. We've been predestined according to the plan of him who works out everything in conformity with the purpose of his will, in order that we, who were the first to hope in Christ, might be the praise of his glory. You also were included in Christ, and when you heard the word of truth, the gospel of salvation, having believed, you were marked in him with a seal, the promised Holy Spirit, who is a deposit guaranteeing an inheritance until the redemption of those who are God's possession, to the praise of his glory. So you have this mark that is representing something that's going to come. It's here, but it's not in its fullness yet. So where I see the hope in all of this and in our world and the ways in which people use their gifts and creativity to harm is that You are called as followers of Christ to be that church along the way, the redeemed community that is saying, we're doing the best we can. Would you come and walk with us? God is taking us somewhere. Would you come and join? And that's why we continue to work at this. That is what our calling is. You have not, the word ecclesia, which I talked about in one of the earlier sermons, it means the called out ones, but it has there's two senses of that call. One is that you're called out, but the other part is that you're called to. And that's what we're going to end up singing about, in that we are called. We're called to something else, to help be that light, to shine for the world, to reflect that image of God. But I have to look at this story and ask myself a very hard question, and it will be on the response screen. Do I ever fear an outcome so much that I take control of the situation in a way that's not yielded to God or to others? Even when I carry out actions, make decisions that I think are in the best interest of others, and then live out the unexpected consequences of those decisions. That can be a tough question to live with. But again, remember, God keeps working with God's people. God keeps working with me. God keeps working with you.